Prince Harry probably never imagined his entire life would end up being dissected chapter by chapter in a series of books written by a man he's never publicly acknowledged. But Tom Bower is back again, and this time he's going even deeper into the marriage between Harry and Meghan Markle. And honestly, the reason people keep paying attention to Bower is because he doesn't really write like a gossip blogger. The man approaches these stories like he's building a legal case. That's why even people who dislike him still end up reading the books. So now Bower is reportedly working on a new edition tied to revenge, and according to people around the project, he believes he found something buried in paperwork Harry signed back in 2020 that explains a lot of what's happened since the Sussexes left the royal family. And the way this story is being framed is pretty brutal for Harry, because the argument basically comes down to one thing. He signed major financial documents during one of the worst emotional periods of his entire life. That timing matters. Remember where Harry was mentally around 2020? He had just blown up his relationship with the royal family, left the institution he grew up in, moved to another country, lost royal protection, and suddenly had to figure out money, business deals, media contracts, lawyers, security costs, all at once. Even people who support Harry admit he looked emotionally exhausted during that period. You could see it in interviews. His eyes looked tired. His body language looked tense. This was a man who had spent his entire life inside a rigid institution and suddenly found himself completely outside of it with no blueprint for what came next. According to Bower's sources, that's also when an amendment to the Sussex prenuptial structure was allegedly signed. And apparently buried inside it was language connected to intellectual property and future earnings tied to the Sussex brand itself. Now, this is where the story starts getting messy. Bower's claim is basically that Meghan Markle positioned herself legally in a way that gave her much stronger control over future Sussex-related projects than Harry realized at the time. Not just current projects, either. Future projects, too. That's the detail everyone is reacting to because if true, it means anything Harry builds later, using his royal identity, his personal history, or even his public image as Prince Harry, could potentially still connect back financially to structures already created during the marriage. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. Harry's entire brand, the one thing that makes him commercially valuable anywhere in the world, is fundamentally built on who he is by birth. He is Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, son of King Charles, brother of the future king, grandson of Queen Elizabeth. That identity cannot be separated from him as a person. But according to Bower, it may have been partially separated from him legally, inside documents he signed during one of the most chaotic periods of his adult life. And honestly, whether people believe every detail or not, you could already see why the storyline exploded online, because people have been questioning the Sussex business setup for years now. The interesting thing is Bower apparently didn't just go looking at legal documents. He reportedly interviewed around 80 people connected to Meghan's professional and personal world while revisiting material for the updated edition. Former staff, Hollywood contacts, people around the Sussex operation. And according to him, the same patterns kept showing up over and over again. One of the biggest themes Bower found across all those interviews was control. Former palace staff allegedly described Meghan as someone who managed Harry's environment very carefully. According to these accounts, information reaching Harry often passed through Meghan first. Friends who questioned decisions reportedly drifted away fast. Staff who raised concerns didn't last long either. And again, this isn't new criticism. Even during the palace bullying controversy years ago, people inside royal circles were already talking about tension behind the scenes. Multiple members of royal household staff reportedly made formal complaints. Some of those people left with settlements. The story never fully died. It just got buried under bigger headlines. Bower basically argues that Harry slowly became isolated inside Meghan's version of events. Now, whether you agree with that or not, you can't deny Harry's entire social world changed dramatically after the marriage. His old friendships faded. His relationship with William collapsed publicly by the time they got to California. Meghan really was his entire support system. His childhood friends were gone. His military friendships had thinned out. His family connections were publicly fractured. The people he'd grown up trusting were no longer in his daily life. That kind of social isolation doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly, through a series of small decisions, small drifts, small arguments that never get resolved. And by the time you realize how alone you are, it's already been years. The Hollywood side of the story is also interesting because Bauer says multiple industry people describe Meghan in almost identical ways without knowing each other. The allegation was that she formed extremely intense working relationships quickly, but once someone stopped being useful professionally, the relationship cooled immediately. Again, people online are going to debate whether that's unfair criticism or just how Hollywood works. Because to be fair, entertainment is a transactional industry. A lot of celebrities operate that way. But Bauer clearly believes Meghan approached relationships strategically long before Harry entered the picture. And according to him, one of the biggest clues comes from Meghan's first marriage, the one most people completely forgot about. Meghan Markle's marriage to Trevor Engelson suddenly started getting re-examined again once Tom Bauer began connecting timelines and legal patterns between that relationship and what later happened with Prince Harry. Back then, Meghan was still trying to establish herself in Hollywood. Trevor was already connected in the television industry. They dated for years, got married in Jamaica in 2011, and then the marriage ended surprisingly fast only a couple years later. Publicly, it looks simple. Quiet divorce, no massive scandal. Everybody moved on. But according to Bauer's reporting, the actual financial negotiations behind that split were a lot more aggressive than people realized. His sources claim Meghan entered those meetings extremely prepared, not emotional, not chaotic, not reactive, prepared. Apparently, she questioned every legal detail, pushed hard on wording, and focused heavily on future financial independence. One detail Bauer keeps emphasizing is a clause allegedly tied to future earnings from projects developed during the marriage. The argument is that Meghan wanted protection over anything connected to her future career growth even after the relationship ended. And Bauer believes that mindset never changed. In his view, Meghan learned very early that controlling future earning potential matters more than dividing current assets. That's the bigger game. And that same game, he argues, played out again on a much bigger stage with Harry. Bauer repeatedly argues that Meghan understands media strategy better than almost anyone around her. Not necessarily in a villainous mastermind way like some internet conspiracy people frame it, but in a very calculated celebrity way. Protect the image. Protect the story. Control perception before someone else controls it for you. He brings up the fallout involving Thomas Markle. That relationship completely collapsed before the royal wedding, and according to Bauer's sources, legal warnings were allegedly already being discussed around media communication before things exploded publicly. Thomas Markle later became one of the biggest embarrassments surrounding the wedding build-up, constantly speaking to tabloids, staging paparazzi photos, creating headlines. But Bauer's argument is that Meghan's team had already identified him as a long-term risk very early. Whether people sympathize with Meghan or not, you can kind of understand why someone entering the royal family would want tight control over messaging. The British press environment is genuinely vicious. But critics argue Meghan took that instinct way beyond normal damage control. Then there's Sunshine Sachs. This part really got attention because Bauer makes a huge deal about when Meghan reportedly hired the PR firm. According to him, it happened very early in the Harry relationship. And Sunshine Sachs isn't just some casual publicity company celebrities use for movie premieres. They're known for handling high-pressure reputation management, crisis situations, and celebrity separations. That's why people started reacting strongly when Bauer framed it this way. His argument basically becomes, why would someone entering a fairy tale royal romance already be thinking about elite crisis management strategy? By the time Harry and Meghan officially left royal duties in 2020, Bauer says the groundwork for independent financial structures was already happening behind the scenes. And this is where the story shifts from relationship drama into pure business territory. According to his sources, Meghan allegedly started building business entities under her own name beginning around 2022. Single-member LLCs, solo trademark filings, independent ownership structures, all things designed to separate assets clearly under California law. American Riviera Orchard became one of the biggest examples people pointed to because Harry's name was nowhere near the filing structure publicly attached to the brand. Same thing with other projects connected specifically to Meghan. For people who weren't paying close attention, this probably looked like normal celebrity entrepreneurship. But Bauer's interpretation is much more pointed. He believes Meghan stopped building a shared Sussex future years ago and quietly began building something designed to survive without Harry entirely. And when you go back to the timeline with that lens, things do look different. The joint Sussex brand was active and prominent in 2020 and 2021, but by 2022 and 2023, something shifted. The public presence started separating. Harry was traveling constantly for his UK lawsuits. Meghan was in California, working on projects under her own name. The joint project started thinning out. At the time, people brushed it off as scheduling differences. But Bauer's basically arguing those years were actually the setup phase for something much bigger. By the time 2023 rolled around, Prince Harry honestly looked like someone carrying the weight of 10 different problems at once. Every time he showed up in London for those court cases against the British tabloids, he looked tense, exhausted, angry, sometimes emotional, and people noticed it immediately. And while Harry was pouring money and energy into those legal battles, Bauer claims Meghan was operating on a completely different track back in California. This is where the financial side becomes really important because Bauer argues the public completely misunderstood the Netflix situation. Everybody heard the massive $100 million number and assumed Harry and Meghan were sitting on endless cash. But according to entertainment insiders who spoke to Bauer, that number represented the maximum possible value. If every contracted project got completed successfully, that never happened. Projects were canceled, deals changed, content plans shifted, and according to Bauer's sources, the actual money that came to was supposedly much lower. The Spotify deal collapsed completely. $18 million deal. One season of a podcast, no renewal. That's a significant revenue stream that simply disappeared. The bigger question for Bauer wasn't how much money arrived. It was where the money was routed. According to people he spoke with, Meghan allegedly established several California single-member LLC structures between 2022 and 2024, and under California law, those structures can become extremely important during asset disputes because they create separation between personal ownership and marital property. Bauer's argument is basically that Meghan was organizing her financial future very carefully, while Harry kept focusing publicly on lawsuits, interviews, memoirs, and emotional war with the royal family. And that's the part of the story that hits hardest. Because even people who dislike Harry usually admit he never seemed particularly interested in business strategy. He always came across more emotional than calculated, more reactive than long-term focused. Meghan, meanwhile, has always looked very image-conscious and business-aware. Even her critics admit she understands branding. Then there's the issue of debt. According to Bauer's financial sources, some liabilities connected to the Sussex operation were allegedly structured so the burden could eventually fall more heavily on Harry, especially expenses tied to his personal lawsuits, international travel, and security issues. Think about the sheer scale of what Harry spent on litigation alone. Multiple court cases in the UK against different tabloid groups. Legal teams in London. Years of proceedings. That's not just emotionally exhausting. It's financially enormous. And if the underlying financial structures of the Sussex business were being organized in ways that separated Meghan's assets from those liabilities, then Harry could end up carrying the legal and financial costs of battles that were originally framed as joint Sussex causes. Whether that would hold up exactly that way in court is another question entirely. But Bauer believes the spending patterns mattered. The financial architecture, in his view, was built intentionally over several years. Once Bauer gets into the custody angle, the tone of the story becomes genuinely sad more than dramatic, because underneath all the gossip, the lawsuits, and the royal headlines, there are still two children involved. Archie and Lilibet are real kids, living in the middle of a situation that neither of them chose. Bauer argues Meghan would likely enter any future custody battle from a very strong position under California family law, because she has reportedly remained a more physically present parent during the last several years. Harry, meanwhile, has spent large amount of time outside California, handling UK court appearances, Invictus responsibilities, interviews, and travel. According to Bauer's sources, documentation of those absence patterns could become extremely important if things ever reach court. California courts prioritize the best interests of the child, and a parent who's been consistently present, consistently in the home state, that parent starts with a structural advantage. And honestly, whether people support Harry or Meghan, this is where the whole thing stops feeling entertaining and starts feeling genuinely tragic. When you step back from the internet drama, Bauer's overall portrait of Harry is basically this: a man who never fully recovered emotionally from losing his mother, never found stable identity inside the royal system, and became deeply dependent on whoever made him feel emotionally safe. Diana died when Harry was 12 years old. 12. He was a child, and he lost his mother in the most public, brutal, traumatic way imaginable. And then he was immediately placed back into royal duties. He grew up in an institution that doesn't really do emotional processing. You grieve privately. You carry on publicly. You don't talk about it. By the time he met Meghan, Harry was already someone who had spent decades looking for a stable emotional foundation. And Meghan, confident, organized, emotionally articulate, warm, apparently gave him exactly that feeling. Bauer believes Meghan recognized that vulnerability immediately. Former palace staff describe Harry as someone who slowly became cut off from almost everybody who once grounded him. Old friends faded. Family relationships collapsed. Advisors disappeared. By the time the California move happened, Meghan was essentially the center of his entire emotional world. That's not unusual for people who've experienced childhood trauma and never properly processed it. The tendency to build your entire world around one person, to trust that person completely because the alternative feels unbearable. And if Bauer's interpretation is even partially accurate, that's why he believes Harry signed legal agreements without fully understanding the long-term consequences. Not because he was stupid, but because emotionally, he trusted Meghan completely during the most unstable period of his life. And when you trust someone that completely, you don't read the fine print the way you should. That's really the core of the entire story Bauer is trying to tell. Not that Harry got outsmarted in some simple gold digger fairy tale that people online reduce it to. What Bauer is actually arguing is something more psychologically interesting and more tragic. He's saying that Harry entered the marriage emotionally damaged, isolated himself from nearly everyone around him, and slowly handed over control of his public identity, his business structure, and his future leverage without realizing how difficult it would be to ever separate those things again. He gave away his past. In Spare, the memoir that detailed the most intimate details of his life, the private conversations with William and Charles. He gave away his present, the Sussex brand, the Netflix deal, the media strategy, all built on his identity, but structured in ways he may not fully own. And according to Bauer, he may have given away his future through those 2020 documents signed during the chaos and grief of the Megxit transition, when he was exhausted and trusting and not thinking like a businessman. But what nobody can argue with is this: the public Harry of 2024 and 2025 looks very different from the Harry who stepped onto that palace balcony in 2011. That Harry looked settled, purposeful, rooted. This Harry looks like someone carrying an enormous amount of weight, fighting battles on multiple fronts simultaneously, with a shrinking circle of people he can actually trust. Whatever the legal and financial reality turns out to be, that emotional reality is already visible. And that might be the most important thing Tom Bauer is pointing to, not the documents, not the LLCs, not the prenuptial amendments, but the slow, quiet, years-long process by which a man who grew up surrounded by people and institutions and structures found himself almost completely alone in a house in California, in the middle of a life he didn't fully plan for and may not fully control. That story, whatever the true details turn out to be, is genuinely one of the most extraordinary things to happen to the British royal family in modern history, and it's nowhere near over yet.